Some people don't disappear suddenly. They leave slowly, almost politely. A message answered a little later. A laugh that doesn't linger as long. A distance that grows just enough to feel safe. They sense attachment forming before it has a name. Before promises. Before expectations. Before the risk becomes visible. And something inside them tightens. Not with panic, but with memory. Memory of closeness that once asked too much. Of connection that became responsibility. Of love that quietly turned into loss. So they step back early. Not because they don't feel, but because feeling has always come with a cost. To others, it can look like emotional coldness, like disinterest, like a sudden change of heart. But beneath the surface, this disconnection is rarely careless. It is deliberate in the most unconscious way. A reflex learned through experience. A boundary formed long before the present moment. These are people who learned that leaving first hurts less. That distance can feel safer than hope. That staying can feel more dangerous than solitude. This is not the story of people who cannot love. It is the story of people who learned to protect love by keeping it just out of reach. This is the psychology of those who disconnect before they get attached. There is a moment when connection begins to feel real. It is subtle, a sense of familiarity, a growing ease, the quiet realization that someone is starting to matter. For some people, this is not where comfort begins. It is where caution does. They don't leave dramatically. There is no conflict, no clear reason, no final conversation. Instead, they slowly step back, emotionally first, then physically, then entirely. Interest fades without explanation. Availability decreases without intention. Often, they don't even recognize what they're doing. It feels natural, reasonable, protective. They might tell themselves they're just being realistic, that the connection isn't right, that something feels off. But beneath these thoughts is a quieter truth. Closeness has crossed an invisible line. This pattern is rarely about the other person. It's about timing, specifically, the moment attachment begins to form. When emotions start to carry weight. When loss becomes possible. To the outside world, it can seem confusing or even hurtful. But internally, it feels like relief. Distance restores balance. Detachment restores control. The early exit is not a lack of depth. It is often the result of too much depth learned too soon. A way of leaving before the heart has to risk staying. Disconnection rarely begins in the present moment. It has a history. Often, it traces back to environments where closeness felt uncertain, where emotional needs were inconsistently met, where attachment came with conditions, unpredictability, or quiet withdrawal. In those early spaces, connection was not always safe. It could disappear without warning. It could turn into responsibility too heavy for a small nervous system. It could invite disappointment that arrived again and again. So the mind adapted. Distance became a form of intelligence. Emotional self-containment became stability. Not needing too much became a way to survive. Later in life, the body remembers this before the mind does. When connection deepens, the nervous system responds as if something dangerous is approaching. Not because it is happening again, but because it once did. This is how withdrawal becomes automatic. Not a choice, but a reflex. Not rejection of others, but loyalty to an old form of safety. What looks like avoidance is often protection learned early and practiced quietly. A belief shaped by experience that staying close means losing something, control, peace, or parts of oneself. Distance was not chosen because it felt good. It was chosen because, once upon a time, it worked. The mind is designed to protect long before it is designed to explain. By the time awareness arrives, the decision has often already been made. When attachment begins to form, the brain scans for familiarity. Not familiarity as comfort, but familiarity as pattern. If closeness once led to pain, the nervous system stores that association deeply, not as memory but as sensation, a tightening in the chest, a sudden loss of interest, an urge to pull away without knowing why. This is not overthinking, it is threat detection. The emotional brain does not wait for proof. It reacts to possibility, to what might happen based on what already has. Attachment activates vulnerability. Vulnerability activates old alarms, and disconnection becomes the fastest way to quiet them. From the outside, it can look irrational. From the inside, it feels logical, necessary, calming. The brain is not trying to sabotage connection. It is trying to prevent a familiar kind of pain. This is why explanation often comes later, after distance has already been created, after safety has been restored. The defense is quiet because it was never meant to be seen. It was meant to work. What makes this pattern so heavy is not the absence of desire. It is the presence of it. These individuals often feel deeply. They notice small shifts in tone. They sense emotional undercurrents others miss. Connection matters to them more than they let on. And that is precisely the problem. The more meaningful the bond becomes, the more exposed they feel, not just to loss, but to dependency, to needing something they may not be able to control. Inside them, two forces move at once. One leans forward, curious, open, hopeful. The other leans back, watchful, tense, prepared to retreat. This creates an internal contradiction. They may crave intimacy while resisting it in the same breath. They may miss people they chose to leave. They may feel lonely even while being emotionally unavailable. There is often quiet grief here. Not always conscious, not always named. A grief for connections that felt possible, but never safe enough to fully enter. So they hover at the edge of closeness, close enough to feel something, far enough to avoid being undone by it. This is not indecision. It is a nervous system caught between longing and protection, trying to survive both at once. For a long time, the pattern feels invisible. Disconnection happens quietly, efficiently, almost automatically. It feels like instinct rather than choice, until one moment interrupts it. Sometimes it is a question asked too gently to ignore. Sometimes it is the same ending repeating with different people. Sometimes it is the strange realization of missing someone. who was never fully allowed to stay. Awareness does not arrive as clarity. It arrives as discomfort, a subtle noticing, a pause between impulse and action, the recognition that the urge to pull away feels familiar and old. In this moment, the story begins to shift, not toward blame, but toward understanding. The distance is no longer seen as personality or preference alone. It is seen as history, as protection that once served a purpose. There is no dramatic transformation here, no sudden readiness for closeness, just a soft acknowledgement. This reaction did not come from nowhere. This awareness can feel heavy, but it can also feel relieving, because what was once mistaken for emotional limitation is finally understood as emotional memory. And understanding, even without change, creates space where the pattern can be observed, rather than immediately obeyed. Staying does not always mean committing. Sometimes it simply means not leaving immediately. For those who disconnect early, presence can feel unfamiliar. Not dramatic, just exposed. There is a quiet discomfort in allowing attachment to exist without controlling its outcome, in letting connection unfold without deciding its ending in advance, in remaining when the impulse says retreat. This is not about forcing closeness. It is about tolerating the feeling of closeness. The nervous system begins to learn something slowly, that intensity does not always lead to loss. That vulnerability does not automatically erase safety. That connection can exist without consuming. Presence here is subtle. It looks like staying curious instead of withdrawing, like noticing the urge to distance without immediately acting on it, like allowing emotion to rise and fall without being managed away. Nothing about this feels heroic. It feels quiet, sometimes awkward, sometimes tiring, but within that quiet effort, something new forms. Not certainty, not trust overnight, just capacity. The capacity to hold connection a little longer than before, to remain through uncertainty without collapsing or disappearing, to discover that safety can sometimes be built, not by leaving early, but by staying present long enough for the body to learn that this moment is not the past repeating itself. Connection does not always arrive as certainty. Sometimes it returns quietly, without promises, without urgency, without demands. For those who learned to leave early, closeness begins to feel different over time. Less like a threat, less like something that must be escaped, more like a space that can be entered slowly. There is still caution, still awareness, still the memory of why distance once mattered. But it no longer needs to dominate every moment. Closeness becomes something that can be felt without being rushed, held without being possessed, experienced without deciding its meaning too soon. This is not the absence of fear. It is the coexistence of fear and presence, the ability to remain even when uncertainty lingers. What emerges here is not perfect attachment. It is gentler than that, more human, An understanding that connection does not have to be permanent to be real. That vulnerability does not erase autonomy. That staying, sometimes just a little longer than before, can be an act of quiet courage. In this space, disconnection is no longer the first language of safety. It becomes one option among many, and closeness, once avoided, is allowed to exist, not as a promise of forever, but as a moment worthy of being felt.